Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Olivier Menon. I am the Events Officer at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar introducing Microsoft Azure, which will be presented by Matt Walton from InfoExchange. Let's start with a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you all shortly after the webinar ends. You will then be able to access it at any time on our website. If you have any question during the session, please type it in a question box on your webinar panel, and Matt will answer them at the end of the session. If you have any technical issue, please also type it in a question box, and I will try my best to help you sort it out. That's all from me, so I'd like to hand over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Ollie, and welcome everyone to today's session as an introduction to Microsoft Azure. So I know there'll be a broad range of people in this session today, whether I'm sure there's a few techies, IT operations people in the session wanting to get quite a bit more detail around how to set this up. But I'm also sure there's a few people who are less technical and probably finance managers or CEOs who really just keen to find out how they get their free $5,000 credit from Microsoft for this service. So we'll cover both of those, and we'll also cover what Azure is suitable for and perhaps what it's not suitable for as well. And I'll go into a bit of the how-tos in terms of if you've decided to use it, some of the different ways that you can implement it. So as Ollie said, I'll save some time at the end for questions, and as always with all my webinars, you feel free to contact me afterwards if there's something specific that you need a question answered or some help with. So we'll get going. For those of you who don't know me or InfoExchange, we're a not-for-profit, and we only help other not-for-profits with technology. So we help organizations of all sizes, whether they're small, very volunteer-led not-for-profits to large national not-for-profits with a lot of infrastructure. And I think the diversity also applies to those with very minimal IT expertise and knowledge to those with big IT teams that we can help as well. So I think one of the things that we do is also help educate people around what products are most suitable. And we are a Microsoft Gold partner, so we do have some expertise in Azure and Office 365 and those sort of products, but we do also help more generally. So that's really my job on a day-to-day basis, is to understand what applications are most suitable for each organization, and hopefully these webinars help you understand that for your organization. But what we see a lot is there are a lot of challenges in the not-for-profit sector around information and technology. So these are some of the things that I encounter on a daily basis when I'm working with organizations and potential ways that technology can help. So one of the key things that people are having issues with is really that remote access, or people who are more out and about at the moment, or wanting to work from home, or using tablets out at client sites. Really, you can't access the information in a way that you expect when you've got that old file server in your office. It is challenging when you're sort of working remotely and just trying to VPN in and get the file server. So this is where cloud comes in. The other one is just that reliable, cost-effective systems and backup. So we're seeing the equation really head to more efficient and cost-effective when you're looking at cloud-based systems at the moment. So look, there is still, as we'll talk about later today, there are still reasons for servers, and in some cases servers can be cheaper, but a lot of these cloud systems are becoming cheaper and more accessible, particularly with donations from organizations like Microsoft. The other one is we find organisations struggle with funding for IT and really justifying it. So often IT is just seen as an expense, and it's balanced against all the other things you want to spend money on, whether it's staffing or marketing or direct service delivery. So finding that consistent funding to justify some of these projects and some of these this infrastructure is often a challenge. And really being able to access that knowledge and resource. So most not-for-profits don't really have the capacity to be able to employ a team of full-time IT people who have broad expertise in all the different applications that you need. So that's often a challenge. So that's where you need to start looking at exploring options for how technology can help you with these challenges. And really the focus of technology should be to help you achieve your mission. So instead of seeing technology as an expense and as a barrier, which many not-for-profits come to us and say, I really want to do all these things, but our technology doesn't let me do it. So it's setting up your technology in a way that gives you flexibility and allows you to respond really quickly when your CEO says, hey, I want to run this webinar, or I want to share this information with a partner organization, or whatever it may be. So it's having that flexibility that means you don't have to go off and buy a server or spend a lot of money every time you want to do anything. And a lot of the time you can justify any investment or any cost or effort by the improved efficiencies that a lot of this technology can do. So whether it's having a video conference to reduce travel and save travel time and money, or improve efficiency of a payroll system, or whatever it may be in terms of reducing manual timesheets. So that's really where IT should be empowering you and helping you. But also around security. So again, the great thing about cloud systems and things like Microsoft Azure is it gives you that redundancy where when your power might be out in your office, or you have some issues, then you should be able to work from anywhere at any location and any time. So that's some of the ways that IT really should be helping you achieve your mission and not just be an expense or a barrier. So what we're seeing is there is a lot more reasons now to move to the cloud. So and from if you're an IT manager or a finance manager, here are some of the reasons that you can use to help you justify and often pay for any implementation costs or any change. So most people come to us when their server's 3 to 5 years old and they're ready to either replace it or find some other solution. And typically when we do the maths, often it works out that instead of replacing their server, it's often cheaper to move to cloud-based systems. So that's often an easy decision to say, okay, you could have a server that requires software licensing, maintenance, on-premise support and backups and all those sort of things, or you could just move to the cloud. And you don't have to worry about it, and Microsoft look after it for you. The other one is around the scalability and flexibility. So we have lots of organizations who merge or bring on new programs and need an extra 50 staff. And if you've got a server-based environment, those sort of big changes require additional hardware and additional sort of capital purchases of another 10 grand to go off and buy another server and install it and those sort of things. So whereas cloud-based systems are typically, you can just turn the dial up and have more users really easily. As I mentioned before, the defending against hardware failure, I used to be an IT manager at a not-for-profit that used to sort of worry at night about servers going down and having to go into the office and fix whatever the issue is, whereas now we can outsource that and let someone else worry about it. the other things around accessing information and just having that single location to reduce the duplication of storing things locally because you can't access the server, from outside the office or from home. So that's that mobility and reliability. So some of the things that not-for-profits come to us from a technology perspective, these are some examples of things that you need to think about as a not-for-profit. Now, as we go through the webinar, we'll give some examples of some of these, and we won't talk about all of these today, but I think we'll be able to pick a few of these where Microsoft Azure can help us. But as you're looking at each one of those, essentially each one is a separate decision around where do I store that? Is it on a server? Is it in the cloud? Can I do it myself? Is there an out-of-the-box product I can buy for that? Or how do I do that? Or just making sure you're thinking about it, things like backups and password policies and those sort of things. So just wanted to, again, put a few of those there to just get you thinking around, have I thought about this? And making sure that as you assess each one, you're working out whether a server-based or a cloud-based option is best. So I know many of you will be in this scenario at the moment, and as I said, I used to be in this scenario where I used to have to be that IT manager who did the regular maintenance, did an upgrade from Windows Server 2008 to 2012 and those sort of things every few years. You had to have your in-house expertise or pay someone to look after it. There was limited scalability, and then you had to explore what the disaster recovery was. So it was off-site tapes and maybe a spare server or another supplier somewhere else that if your servers went down, you would have to go off and buy a new server or come up with some arrangement. And the uptime requirements, we actually found that by the time you do all your reboots and all your maintenance, the uptime and availability, we were having to take the servers down every weekend to do maintenance and those sort of things. So that wasn't great for the users who wanted access to it on the weekend. So this is where we could start bringing in the cloud-based systems, where you're looking at outsourcing to the experts. So really the key is around reliability. So having Microsoft guarantee that they're going to have that the platform's up 99.9% of the time is significantly better than most of the not-for-profits we see who have their own servers. And the backups as well. So they've got often redundancy between different locations, Melbourne and Sydney, for example, so that if for some reason Melbourne wasn't accessible, you would be able to access it through the Sydney data centre. And they look after all those things like the security compliance and certifications and making sure they're up with the latest malware attacks and all those sort of things. So it means you don't have to think about that and constantly pay for products that do that. A lot of that's inbuilt into the one product. And it's always up to date. So if you're on Office 365, for example, you're just on the latest version of Exchange all the time. So as opposed to having to upgrade every few years. And the systems that we use, again, particularly with Azure or Office 365, these are enterprise quality. So these are the same systems that governments and banks and large mining companies use because it's not a scale-back version that's just for not-for-profits. And it's easy to expand, as I've said before. When we've had organisations merge and double in size, it's easy to just scale up. And essentially, you're only paying for what you need. We've had organisations who have needed an extra, 5 people on their server environment, but their servers were at capacity, so they've had to buy a whole new $10,000 server just for 5 new users. Whereas for this Azure and cloud-based environment, you just can scale up as a user and scale down the next month if you decrease in size as well. So really, from a comparison perspective, the cloud versus local infrastructure, they're generally quite different. So with Azure, there are ongoing monthly costs. So you basically pay for what you use, whether that's a service or storage, and you just pay on that monthly basis. So it's more an operating expense. Whereas a server, it's a once-off capital purchase. And those costs, usually with a capital purchase, you buy it once and then you install software, you install the licenses, and then you do the installation. So whereas with the cloud server, everything's combined in one service generally. Obviously, from a cost perspective, the Azure, you get the $5,000 Azure credit, which I assume most of you have heard about. Essentially, Microsoft are allowing you to use $5,000 worth of Azure services for free. Anything more than that, you obviously pay for, but the first $5,000 is free. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. With the server-based infrastructure, you can obviously get your donated licenses and software through connecting up. So there are two different models for doing that. Obviously with Azure, and we'll touch on internet in a minute, but you are relying on the internet and your network to go up and down and send the information across and access it from Azure. Whereas for your server, you're relying on your local network and often being in the same building or location to access that information. And as we said, the maintenance required for those servers is ongoing. You need monthly reboots and backups and all of those sort of things. Whereas with Azure, it's a lot easier and it's more automated updates. So that's really the balance. So obviously with Azure, you need to consider what happens if you go offline, whereas the server, you need to make sure you've got your offsite backups in case something happens to your building. So from a comparison, they're the two different options. And again, there's no right or wrong option, and this webinar isn't about saying you all have to move to Azure. It's about saying here are some options, and in many cases, you'll use both or a combination of both. So, and that's what we're seeing from a trend perspective. So we're seeing that, probably 10 years ago, everyone was on physical servers, physical boxes. But over the last 10 years or more for some of you, you've been virtualizing a lot of that. So you've still got servers in your office, but on that one physical box, you've had multiple virtual servers, which again gives you a bit of redundancy as well and reduces the risk. But what we've been seeing over the last few years is people moving to that hybrid cloud where you do some stuff locally on your servers, and you might have one or two servers in your office, but a whole heap of other servers or products in the cloud. So many of our clients who have servers also still use Office 365 and maybe as parts of Azure in the cloud. Whereas I think that the future moving forward is really once our network and once the internet gets a bit better, you might be able to rely more on a fully cloud-based environment. So let's get into some detail around Azure now that we've sort of talked a bit broader around infrastructure. So essentially, it's a really broad technology platform that allows you to pay as you go and do a range of tasks or store information. And it's a really quite a diverse suite, and it's changing every day. But you can essentially buy these services off Microsoft, and most things that you used to do on a server or from a technology perspective, you can now buy from Microsoft. So this next slide is a bit more sort of in my words, but essentially they have data centers in Australia. So there's one in Sydney and one in Melbourne, and they have racks and racks of servers that they host all of this information for you. So you essentially select a service from Microsoft and they look after it for you. And then you access it over the internet to get that service. Now, in terms of what you can do with Azure, as I said, there's a broad range and it's changing every day, and there's a lot more. And some of you, may be interested in the really, advanced stuff around analytics or data lakes or web and mobile. Whereas most of you, what we're seeing is actually more interested in some of the basics of replacing the basic infrastructure that you've had. So most people have had a server in their office with a domain controller and file server and maybe hosting some basic applications. So you can replace most of that with Azure. So a lot of people, that's a starting point where they're wanting to just, instead of buying new servers or hosting them in their office, they're basically replicating that in an Azure environment. So essentially letting Microsoft host those servers for you instead of having them locally or in a data center. The other thing that, and to be honest, most of our current clients are moving towards this, and if not all, we've been promoting it and encouraging people strongly, is storing their backups. So you used to, stick a tape or an external hard drive into your server and copy that, and then that tape would go with your receptionist or whoever, go home or into a car or at a paid service where they store it off in a warehouse. But what you can do now is actually store that in Azure. So essentially every night there's a job that runs on your server that backs up your server into Azure, and it just stores there. So as a minimum, even if you're keeping all your local servers, I would encourage you to look at those sort of options. The advantage, one of the advantages that has is that makes disaster recovery easier. So if you've got all your backups sitting in Microsoft Azure and your location goes down or your power or your server dies, then it's a lot easier to restore all that data or systems or whatever it may be up in Azure and actually run off Azure. So a lot of our clients are having that disaster recovery scenario covered by storing their data in Azure and having the ability to run that up as a service on the occasion that they may need it. And as we said before, it's only pay as you go. So you're only actually paying for that disaster recovery option if you need it. The other thing, a lot of people are looking at website hosting and application hosting. So if you've got a custom application that you can't move to a cloud-based one, then you can essentially either run up a server and host it in Azure or buy that application hosting as a service in Azure. So they're the top 5 that we're seeing common not-for-profits using. So they're some of the most common ones that I think might be suitable for you. So I think it's important to understand the different types of services that both Azure and Microsoft offer more generally. So you see the color coding there around the software as a service. So things like Office 365 or OneDrive or Dynamics, you can just buy as a service, and that's a product that you buy. And Azure Backups and Azure Site Recovery, which we'll touch on a little bit more, fits into that. You just basically say, okay, I want a Azure Backup, you buy it and you install it, and that's ready to go. Whereas the green one, which is Platform as a Service, where you actually, this would be the scenario where you log on to Azure and you run up a server in Azure. So it's giving you a platform. What you do with that server is up to you. So it's more flexible than the Azure Backup, which is a very, here's the product and you use it. Whereas the Platform as a Service, the green column there, is you run up a server and you install whatever you want to install on it. Or here's some storage, you store whatever you want there. So it's a bit more, it gives you a bit more flexibility. Whereas the infrastructure as a service there, the blue column, essentially that is even more flexible. That's just giving you the infrastructure and then you build on top of that. So if you were developing custom apps, for example, or storing, there are a lot of even software providers that are building their software systems and client management systems on top of the Azure environment. So that would be the infrastructure as a service. So when we're talking about all these things in Azure, it's important for you to understand what type of service it is, whether it's a service that you buy or whether it's a service that you configure, or whether it's just the platform that you buy and then pay on top of that. The other thing that's important to know is many of the things that not-for-profits ask us for, you don't actually need Azure for. So things like Office 365, if you just want email, you don't need Azure. So if all you want is email, then you can get that in Office 365. I've put some non-Microsoft options there, like Gmail. And the same with documents. So if all you're wanting to do is store a few documents, you can use OneDrive. And likewise, many of our clients actually replace their file servers with SharePoint. So some of our organizations that we work with, they used to have a file server. So instead of just picking that file server up with Exchange on it, with files on it, with MyOb on it, and putting it in Azure, we actually look at each of those applications and go, well, actually, put your email in Office 365, put your files in SharePoint, and put MyOb in MyOb Online, and you don't need a server, and you probably don't need Azure. You may still need backups or some other service, but it's important to look at that. And the same with websites. So when people say, yep, you can host your websites in Azure, definitely you can, but in many cases, if you're using a product like Squarespace, they host it for you, so you don't actually need that hosting. And the same with client management and CRMs and some of the other ones on there. So that's important to look at. When you're looking at each product, does it already have a hosted option where they cover all the hosting costs on your behalf? So I expect that a lot of you, the majority of your requirements will be covered by that. So I think as we touched on before, there are several application hosting options. So you can have local server infrastructure, and you can store everything on your local server. You can have that public cloud or software as a service where everything is hosted by a provider for you. So whether that's Salesforce, Dynamics, etc. You can have Azure infrastructure. So this is where you run up a server in Azure and you install whatever you want on it, whether it's RDP or SQL. Or there's web apps in Azure that, again, you can develop on top of the Azure infrastructure. So when you're considering each application, just have a look at some of these options and work out what is best for you. When you're considering your options, basically whether you have a local server or move everything to Azure, one of the first questions we ask people is, how is your internet? Because essentially, if you're moving, let's say you're wanting to move all your files up to Azure, an Azure file server, for example, or a local application. If you've got lots of people sitting in that office and a poor ADSL connection, and you're wanting to move that application or those files all up into Azure, then all day, every day, all those staff are going to have to go over the internet into Azure to access the information they need, and then pull that down when they need to. So there are potential issues with that where if it's a really poor connection, the performance is going to be really slow over that, particularly if you're trying to do lots of things. So if you're trying to run video conferencing and you're trying to run your backups over Azure and you're trying to log in and download files and those sort of things, then you need to look at upgrading your internet. And this is where the balance of cost can often be a factor. So if, for example, you're in a regional area and internet is exorbitantly expensive and NBN's a long way away, it might actually be cheaper to have a server. And we've done this several times where we've actually said, No, based on your poor internet and that you can't upgrade at a cost-efficient level, then maybe let's put a server in for 3 years while we're waiting for the internet to be upgraded and some of these other applications to move to the cloud. Whereas most of the organisations that are either Melbourne Metro or Sydney Metro or Brisbane can justify upgrading to like a 100 meg fibre connection, for example, particularly if you're a large organisation over 50 staff, then usually that's easy to justify, and it still works out cheaper, even if you're paying, you know, $1,000 a month for a fibre connection or 500 maybe. It's still often cheaper than building and buying and maintaining lots of servers in your office. So these are some things you need to look at. The other factor here is how many locations do you have? So I know we're working with a client at the moment who has 6 different locations. And yes, it's easy to upgrade the internet at the head office, but if we also have to put fibre in these other 6 locations, it starts getting very expensive. So you need to look at scaling the internet for each location. And also when you connect in, I think we've mentioned there, you need a good router at each site that's compatible with Azure, and you also need that site-to-site VPN, which connects through that router, and that's a service that you pay for through Azure as well. So there's a few things to think about before you just automatically go, yep, we're going to just dump everything in Azure and see how it goes. So there's some network and infrastructure that you need to support that for you. So what I might do now, I was keen to talk through a case study. So, and this is a common case that that I thought might be relevant to many of you. And this is an organisation that do have multiple offices, so they didn't necessarily have one main office. So they had 2 big offices in Melbourne and Sydney and small offices in Brisbane and Perth, and people out and about as well. So based on that, they had a strong preference not to move to server infrastructure. So they didn't want to put a server in their Melbourne office, which would make it harder for their people in Sydney to access, and vice versa. So they also wanted to move to cloud-based applications and laptops. So they really wanted to push a mobile workforce. So most of the systems that they use are cloud-based anyway. So again, it's Office 365. They use SharePoint for documents, Exchange for email, and even some of the collaboration tools and Skype for Business as part of Office 365. And they use Salesforce for all their client management and CRM and those sort of things. So that was covered off. You didn't need Azure for either of those. But they also needed that central management of PCs, printing, archives and backups. So they had 100 PCs. So if they didn't have some sort of server environment, when we want to update a new version of Adobe Reader or whatever it may be, we would have to do that manually. Whereas having some sort of central management of that allows you to configure printers and sort of treat it like you used to when you had a server in your office. So what we did is we essentially developed an Azure solution to cover off that central management of the PCs. So we gave them a domain controller, which is what most of you would have had on a server environment in your office. We set up a site-to-site VPN between the 2 main sites, and the remote users just access the applications. And we also set up storage of backups and a file server archive. So while they put a lot of their stuff on SharePoint for their day-to-day, they also wanted some things on a file server, and particularly things that weren't compatible with SharePoint. So as you can see here, the majority of the stuff that they had was cloud-based. So it's public internet. So really they just went over the internet into Exchange or SharePoint. But the Azure environment it connected those 2 sites and to Azure, They did have 100 meg fibre at those two locations. They were both CBD locations in Melbourne and Sydney, so they were both easy and reasonably cost effective to get that connection. But essentially mean that staff can actually pick up their laptops and move between the Melbourne and Sydney office or move around the office and access all the information and get those updates and get that central management of PCs. So this is quite a common scenario. They didn't have any specific requirements around hosting applications or their websites hosted externally, I think on WordPress, and it's a pretty basic scenario here where really they just needed that central management of their environment. So what most of you will be interested in, I'm sure, is what does that type of arrangement cost? And the costs are very scalable, and to be honest, they change every day. So I didn't actually check this morning whether these costs had changed since I did these slides last, but the costs are scalable and user-based and storage-based. So essentially when you build, they build two servers in Azure. So you can choose from some pre-configured servers. So what our engineers did is looked and worked out what they needed to run a domain controller and a file server and AAD Connect. And they said, okay, based on that, we think it needs 2 cores, 3.5 gig of RAM, 135 gig of disk, etc. And that is an A2 server on Azure. So they logged into Azure and essentially purchased two A2 servers. And that was that $428 a month was the cost of running 2 servers in Azure. The other things that you need to buy to help support those servers is that VPN gateway. So there is a monthly cost associated with having that gateway between the 2 sites. Now again, that was on an Azure approved router at both of those sites, and it's the data transfer between those offices. So you actually get a quota of 100 gig, and this cost was based on 744 gateway hours in that month. So again, different months they actually charge you different things because some months are 28 days, some months are 31 days. So it's basically per hour is the billing. And they also charge you for storage. So we thought 600 gig storage was suitable, and it's basic storage, and it's a certain type of redundancy. Now you can pay for different levels of redundancy and different levels of geolocation. So you can pay to have it across both Melbourne and Sydney Microsoft data centers. So you can pay to not just have it in Melbourne, but if the Melbourne data center goes down, you don't have that redundancy. So often our clients pay to store it in both, but essentially you're storing the data twice if it's in multiple locations. So that was the $61 for storing those files and backups. And the other thing that we usually recommend is you can actually pay for like a premium support from Microsoft, and they actually give you quite good support for your Azure environment. So that was that extra $36 a month. So essentially, this is the equation that we tried to work out whether it was more efficient to get a server or not. And based on this, they were going to pay $8,615 a year, but obviously they get the Microsoft credit for $5,000, so that comes off that cost, and they pay $3,615 a year. Now that might cost, seem a lot, but when we did the math and compared it to the local server, it was actually still more cost efficient to have that, even over 3 years. If you add that up over 3 years, it's over 10 grand. But the amount it was going to cost them to both buy servers, manage those servers, buy the software, buy the licenses, it was going to cost them more than 10 grand over 3 years. And this also helps give them better mobility and better general access. So that's where that actually made sense for this organization. But those sums you can actually go and do yourself. So there is quite an easy calculator, which is basically what our engineers do when I say, hey, can you quote for this? They go onto that calculator and put in this and select an A2 server and select the storage and the gateways and whatever else you want. So that's really probably the first step for a lot of you, is to go onto the calculator and work out what estimate cost would be to store your infrastructure on Azure. So when you're in that Azure environment, it is really flexible. So this is essentially a bit of a how-to, and you see the image on the right. That's an image of when we went in and went to create the storage account. So this is what the Azure Admin portal looks like on the right there, and as you can see, it's just lots of different options. So you go in and just select your different option, and the cost will be associated on that. So one of the first options that you're given is the region. So this is where you can guarantee that your data is going to live in Australia. So for those of you where that's important, you can actually just go, yep, I'm selecting Australia East, which is Sydney, or Australia Southeast, which is Melbourne. Or as I said, you can have that geo-redundancy. You can turn that on or off, is just one of the settings where you can say, yes, I want it stored in both. Or if your contract actually says your data needs to be stored in Melbourne, then you just don't select the geo-redundancy and just store it in Australia Southeast. And they're the different storage options. So essentially it's a bucket of storage that you can select and use on an ongoing basis. And the gateways for the VPNs and the subnets. So essentially, some of this function is very similar to what you would do if you were building a server in your office. So it's looking at things like the subnets and the network and the VPNs. It's very similar, but this is just, it's got a easy user interface on the Azure portal, and it's a bit more flexible with options. And this is where you come to choose your servers, basically. It's a bit like shopping, where you're just walking around the server store and you get to choose which one suits you best. So as you can see there's some standard options that Microsoft have packaged up. So essentially it's a packaged up server where you can say, okay, I want the DS1 V2 because I only want 1 core and 3.5 gig, for example. So this is where you just select what you want, and it's all included in that. And likewise, you put in things like IP addresses and monitoring and availability and all of those other things that you would do if you were building a server in your environment. So one of the things I was keen to talk you through today is the sign-up process. So for those of you who are thinking, yep, this is suitable for us, or at least I want to get in and have a little bit of a play and do some pricing and do some testing and have a look around, then it's actually reasonably easy to sign up. Now, the first thing that we would recommend, and we've had a few people caught out on this, you sign up to Office 365 first. So the whole process is actually a lot easier if you already have an Office 365 tenant set up. So if you're looking at doing both, do the Office 365 tenant first. And that way the grant then applies and links with your Office 365 tenant. And that's a huge advantage because it really links the two and it gives you that authentication between the two accounts, and it knows that you're the same organization running the two. So that really gives you some good benefits of linking the two. But if you do them totally separately, if you go off and do Azure first and then you go off and do 365 later, then it actually will treat you as two separate organizations. So activate the subscription from the 365 Admin Center if you've already got 365. And the other key thing that you need to do to get that $5,000 credit, basically, is to go to Connecting Up, or TechSoup if you're in New Zealand, and get that validation token. So if you just log into your Connecting Up account, as part of your account, it will show you that token. So it's basically, there's a bit of a link there to an article that Connecting Up wrote, and you basically go and get your token, and then you enter it into the portal. So again, there's a link there to a portal, and what that's doing, it's basically telling Microsoft that you're the same organization and you are eligible, and proving that you're eligible for that $5,000. And then they'll apply it to that tenant for you. So this is why you have to use the same admin email and an ID, so that you will be sent that link to activate it. And then make sure you're signed in as the Office 365 admin, and then click on the link, and then the credit's available for you. And yes, you will need to put in a credit card, but nothing will come off that credit card unless you go over your $5,000 limit, and then it will start charging you for storage. So you do need to be aware of that. But then essentially it's you log into that portal and you start having a play around. So essentially that's where you can really get to understand the pricing and what servers might be right for you. So it's a reasonably easy process. And look, even if you're not sure, 100% sure if you're going to go ahead, you can go through this process without committing too much or without making any changes to your environment. So yeah, generally that's a good place to start. The other thing to think about, and is really important, is the roadmap. So they're bringing out new products every day, and it can be confusing, but it can also be exciting that there are always new products. So I get the subscription because I'm an admin of a tenant, and I get a newsletter every day saying, you know, here's all these new things that are coming out. And you do need to be wary. So there was one recently where Azure have released a file server in Azure. So it's essentially trying to replicate exactly an on-premise file server as an Azure service. So I was really excited about that. A lot of our clients are asking for that. But I said, hey, to one of our engineers, hey, can you do a bit of research and testing on this? And they came back and said, yep, Matt, it's been released. It looks like there's potential, but don't touch it for 3 months because there's this gap, this gap, this gap, and it's not quite suitable. And even then, it would only be suitable if they had a good internet connection and they had this and they had that. So there are always caveats, so don't get too excited or taken away and jump in too early. You just need to do a bit of testing and keep an eye on things as they're coming out. So, but yeah, log on the link there. There are some really good things coming out. So, just wrapping up, conscious of time, and I'm going to save some time for questions at the end. Some of the things that you need to think about before you go off and sort of move everything to Azure. The first thing is, does it have a hosted option? So I would rarely encourage and almost never encourage people to go and host MyOb on Azure, for example. You've got MyOb Online for that. Don't host Exchange on Azure. Don't host SharePoint on Azure because you've got Exchange Online and SharePoint Online for that. So unless you've got a really good reason and some customization or something like that you need, you would do that. And obviously you need to compare the costs of things like MyOb Online to hosting it yourself. Generally what we're finding is most organizations like MyOb, for example, and Microsoft are actually encouraging you to move to the online. They don't want to support the server-based subscription model anymore. So often it's even cheaper or more attractive to move to the cloud-based online services. The other thing is check what's compatible. So if you've custom built an application or you've got an application from a third-party vendor, you need to ask them, can we put this on Azure? Will it work? There are some minor limitations and not everything can automatically work. And are your routers compatible? So if you've got a 5-year-old router in your office and you're looking at setting up a site-to-site VPN with Azure, I would suggest that you probably need to replace that and make sure it's compatible with Azure. But a lot of the stuff that you get from connecting up, like the Cisco's routers and those sort of things, are all compatible. So a lot of the recent ones are compatible. But have a look at that link there. And what we're seeing is most, if not all, of organizations that are moving to Azure probably need to upgrade their internet connection, or at least have, again, it depends on your size and what you're doing, but you need to weigh in those costs of whether that internet cost is going to be more expensive than replacing your servers, basically. And are you eligible for the credit? Now, if you're eligible for the free Office 365 E1s, and also through connecting up, if you're eligible for the donation program where you buy Office and server licenses, then you're pretty much guaranteed that you'll be eligible for the Azure credit. So essentially, if you're eligible for the Microsoft donation program, you are eligible for this credit. But there's also exceptions around different sort of programs for the education sector or the health sector or other people that may not be part of the Microsoft donation program. So it's worth checking that before you commit too heavily. And really it's about doing the business case and working out the total cost of ownership. So yeah, where it is actually going to be cheaper to have a local server and support that and manage that, then yeah, we put in a local server recently for a small organization where it actually worked out over a 3 to 5 year period. It was going to save them, 10, 15 grand to keep a local server. So we actually recommended that. So it's not you have to use Azure for everything sort of scenario. So these are some things for you to think about. So, and even more broadly, here are the sort of key top tips that we encourage people to think of. And this is broader than Azure, but just want to bring it back to your bigger IT planning process and your technology solution. Is where are you going to be in 5 years? So if you bought a server today, is that going to be still relevant and suitable in 5 years? And if not, then something like Azure might actually be more suitable. And likewise, from a growth, we have a lot of organizations who are very office-based today, but in 2 or 3 years, they expect to have 5 offices around the country and a mobile workforce. So investing in a server now probably isn't a great way to go. The other one is looking at those applications. So often the decision around Azure is based on what applications you need. And if you're moving to Dynamics or Salesforce and Office 365, then maybe you're small, maybe you don't need Azure at all. Maybe it's all just application focused. But looking at how your staff work and whether they're all office-based or whether they need to work from home and how many mobile devices they use can dictate whether a site-to-site VPN is going to be suitable or relevant, or whether there are other options for having apps that they can use on their mobile devices, for example. And the other point there is staging. So it's about, you don't feel you need to do everything or move 100% to Azure straight away. As I said, many of our clients who have servers just use Azure for backups. So that could be a starting point where you do that first. Or another group of clients who have server infrastructure are having a secondary domain controller in Azure, and they have that in parallel with their local infrastructure. Whereas others have just said, no, we're moving everything at once because that makes more sense. So just do that assessment for your organization. And yeah, as I said, in most of our clients, they actually have a combination of both, particularly the larger ones. And yeah, look, it is getting easier in terms of the Azure portal and running up servers and those sort of things, but it is, as always, worth having some of that expert advice, whether that's an internal staff member or board or someone like InfoExchange or your local provider, so to give you expertise. And really it's weighing up the business case. So the business case isn't just about money, but it's about change and reducing risk and improving the expectations of your staff. All right, so they're my top tips, and I'm going to allow some time for questions. As I said, if I have talked too much and haven't left enough time for questions, for too many questions, I will happy for you to email me or contact me, and either one of my engineers or I can get back to you with a bit more detail. So feel free to email some of your questions. But Ollie, happy to open it up for a few minutes if you like.
Thank you, Matt. Let's start with a very quick question. I'm sure you mentioned that before, but can you please clarify if the $5,000 credit is a one-off or an annual credit?
Microsoft actually haven't committed either way, so I can't answer that. I'm hoping and expecting that it's a recurring credit, but I haven't got confirmation on that from Microsoft yet. So there is a risk and a chance that it could be a once-off, and they might not do that on a regular basis, but I do know Microsoft are pretty committed to the sector and also keen to promote the use of Azure. So if I had to guess, I think it will be recurring, but I can't guarantee that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Matt. A question from Jennifer. What is the actual impact if you signed up for Azure first and then Office 365 later? You mentioned that Microsoft would always see both accounts as separate entities, but what does that really mean for people who are using them?
Yeah, generally it comes back to authentication and linking the different accounts. Look, it's a bit of a complicated question because there are multiple different ways to do authentication, whether you're doing your local Active Directory or local or Azure Active Directory or a range of others. So I might have to take that one offline about your Jennifer's specific example. But look, it's not the end of the world if you've already signed up to Azure and not Office 365, but yeah, if you're starting from scratch, that's what we'd recommend. It just links the two accounts closer together.
Thank you, Matt. It's not really a question, and it's not necessarily about Azure, but Mal seems to think that SharePoint is pretty complicated to manage and it's too complex for a small charity. I don't know if you've got any opinion on that or anything to say about that.
Look, it is something that we have found to be effective for many of our small charities. So a lot of our clients use SharePoint, but I agree that often you need help setting it up, or we have seen people who have gone off and just set it up without sort of thinking it through and without having some knowledge around the best ways to set up SharePoint and some of its limitations, have got into some trouble. And it is different from a file server, and I think that's often the issue, where people expect that moving things, you know, from a local file server to SharePoint and just treating it the same. It is quite a different system. So we actually have a webinar, I think, in a few weeks on SharePoint, and that will go through that in a bit more detail around how to set that up. But I think also there are multiple ways to do document management. So again, it's coming back to what are your requirements, and then weighing up whether a local file server is ideal, or whether SharePoint, or maybe down the track file servers in Azure. But what we found is if you're expecting a good experience with a file server in Azure, you need a really, really good internet connection. So I wouldn't automatically just dump a file server in Azure either, because the performance can be poor if it's over a poor internet connection. So again, happy to talk a bit more detail about SharePoint offline, or dial into the next webinar, or even do-it-yourself workshop. We have one on SharePoint as well. So, but yeah, any product is not suitable for everyone. So it might be that that organization is not suitable for SharePoint, and that's okay.
Thank you, Matt. And the webinar about SharePoint is on the 28th of September, if you're interested. That was the last question. So is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up, Matt?
No, just to say thank you, and feel free, if I didn't answer your question properly, or you had some more questions, feel free to email me or give me a call on the mobile. All right, thanks everyone, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for presenting, Matt. It was very informative as always. Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. Just to remind you, the recording will be available on our website very shortly, and the link to that recording will be sent to you. If you have any questions that come to your mind later on, or any feedback, please feel free to send that through to events@connecthub.org, or you can, as Matt said, you can email him directly using his email address that is on your screen. And we'll answer those questions offline. Again, thank you for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day.